Hello, as many of you know, I'm Dan Demers. I'm very excited that you're joining us today for this fun conversation that I get to have with Curby Graham. Curby's joined our board really just in an advisory capacity. He has a lot of experience in classical education, and he's been a good friend over the past few months as I've gotten to know him.
Thanks, Dan. It's good to be here.
Tell me just for a few minutes, what has been your experience with classical education, and why did you decide to help us in this new endeavor?
Well, I can actually say my experience in classical education started with my bachelor's degree. I ended up with a degree in humanities. Even though I didn't make the connection, I studied a lot of classics, a lot of philosophy, a lot of Greek, Roman culture, literature, and background. And then years later, I ended up reading a series of books, and one of them was called Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, and it was on just something called classical education. And I was single at the time. When I read the book, I realized, wow, if I ever get married and have kids, I want my kids to have this education because I didn't get anything this interesting. And that was years ago. I think it was around 1994. It was about the time I joined the military. And I was in the service for 22 years. But when my daughters were old enough to go to school, I have two girls. When my oldest was old enough to start in kindergarten, we were at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and we found a classical school there, along with several other schools that we interviewed with. But we realized right away this is where we wanted our girls to be. And so my daughter's oldest started in kindergarten, and a little bit later my youngest joined her. I ended up being on the board there as a vice president. And then it came time, as it always does, to retire. And I was looking at going back to my hometown in San Antonio. And my wife said, well, we want to keep our girls in a classic school. Don't you have a friend that works in one in San Antonio? I was like, oh, gosh, yeah. So I contacted them and said, we'd like to come and get our girls. And it was called Geneva School of Boerne, Texas. And he just said, hey, why don't you just come and retire, and you can be my academic dean, you can teach, and your girls can go to the school. And so that was how I ended up in that career. So I did that for about 6 years, and they had a little stopover at another school for just a little bit, but it wasn't a good fit for my family. So we decided to come back here and be near my wife's family here in Wisconsin. I'm a Texas boy, but Wisconsin is my second home. And I was, through a conversation with my pastor, was connected with your pastor and asked to help advise, which I'm very happy to do, because I'm a big advocate of classical education because I've seen it in my own daughter's lives.
Fun.
Okay, well, Dan, now it's my turn to ask some questions. All right, now I've been in classical education for a long time. I'm a huge believer on it, so I don't have to be sold on this, but you're new to this, so tell me, why classical education? Why are you involved in helping set up the school? Why do you find it so important?
It's been an interesting year for my wife and I. We've been to a few conferences and even visited a number of classical Christian schools around the country. And I've been really excited as we've met more people who have been educated through the classical Christian model. These are young adults who are sure of their faith. They are articulate, they are intelligent, and they know what their purpose is in life. And those have been some really fundamental things that have shifted in my mind. But as I've studied classical education more, I've loved the standpoint that it comes from. It's seeking to build wisdom and character in a student through education, as opposed to the traditional or the progressive model of school right now is, let's shoot for test scores and job placement. And this whole concept of wisdom and virtue is almost non-existent in the public schools or even other Christian schools today.
Okay, can you expand on that a little bit more? You've given me the big picture. Let's narrow it down. What else do you want to say as far as for a parent out there?
So classical educators, so our teachers, I've found this to be really interesting. We believe that students can experience God through all subjects. Simple things like learning about how God created order and beauty in the universe through math and geometry. This is a new concept to me about a year ago. Even things like how can we learn about harmony and beauty through music. Because God created the world, He is in the world, and He owns all of the world, we get to experience Him through little and simple things like that I took for granted for many years.
Good. One thing I learned at my school is that we used to tell our students that what they were getting was what was a classical university education.
Okay.
Because university had the term universal. It tied all knowledge together, whereas now it's fragmented. So what you said is exactly correct. Things like beauty and math, most people don't think those would go together along with music, but they're all, in geometry, but those are all tied together. So that's great. Okay, well, classical education, and I say this from my background, is a lot more rigorous than most education. And it is, we're also, your kids are going to be going out into a much more challenging world. So how does classical education help them prepare for that?
So this has been really fun for my wife and I to read about this and be in some study and some classes on starting a classical Christian school. The subjects themselves are what we'll refer to as integrated subjects. All subjects have relation to each other, and they ultimately point a child or a student to Christ. We should be able to learn math and learn music and learn about God's character through philosophy.
Can you tell me how you see classical education as tying all these fields of knowledge together? What have you experienced so far? What have you seen with some of the students that you've encountered in your new journey here?
So it's a good question. Thank you for asking. So my understanding with how students view knowledge, math and science and music and literature, those are all connected, and they create in the student a really holistic view of the world. They also understand that this world is is subject to God and His whims and how He decides to work and move throughout history. So when we know that all these things that God has created are subject to Him, and we live under that lordship of Christ.
Well, we were saying classical education is rigorous, but how so? Why is it different from a public school? I mean, more iPads, more computer time? How's it more rigorous?
So when a student understands that the philosopher that they're reading about, or the math curriculum that they're involved in, or the science lesson that they had, when they understand how these are all connected to each other, all these different subjects should point them towards Christ, and they have a much more holistic and robust worldview. And we believe that when children are educated and equipped in this way, they can go out into the world and they can be such incredible difference makers for Christ.
Okay. All right. Well, having said that, okay, you're starting them off through all this. What's the end product? When they graduate, what do you want to see in one of your students? Is it just about them getting a good job? Is it just about, hey, we've just been a missionary school? What do you want to see in terms of your graduate? What should that look like? Give me a portrait of a graduate in your mind.
So the three stages of education are grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and they really do a good job of building on each other. When my wife and I visited a classical school in the Milwaukee area, we saw young students learning to pay attention to detail, learning to speak, learning to be obedient, and learning just to articulate some very simple thoughts back to the teacher. As our students grow, they will get to discover all the beautiful things in this world that God has created, how different subjects are integrated with each other, and then ultimately we plan on having classes around philosophy, apologetics, and debate and rhetoric, all within the high school level, so that we can have really clear thinkers, articulate adults. One thing that I personally notice is that many young people that I talk to don't seem to have a standard or a basis for truth. This movement's been around for a long time, but the idea that I can create my own truth, I can say and decide what is true, but if there's a standard, there is a standard, it's God's Word, and if our students know and believe that, they're going to be so much more excited when they go off to college, when they go off to the next stage in life, having already wrestled with some of these really difficult and challenging ideas that the world is throwing at them.
Excellent. Well, I'm saying that as an apologist, it's my background, my master's degree, and having taught for 6 years in apologetics and history and historical theology,
Okay.
I saw a lot of my students, they would always go off to school, and almost all of them would come back and they would thank us for the education they got because they were so much farther ahead. But I also had so many of them come back, and when they were challenged with new ideas or philosophies, they weren't intimidated by that. They didn't lose their faith. They didn't go, oh my gosh, I don't know how to deal with this. Even if they didn't have an immediate answer, they knew that, well, hold on, they're smart Christians. I know there are answers to this, even if I don't know the specific one. And a lot of them did know the answers. In fact, a lot of times they come back and go, yeah, sometimes the professor will throw out things that he thinks are really challenging, and that's stuff we dealt with when I was a freshman. So I'm just saying that is another advantage. And I'm not saying it's a magic, or silver bullet, but it inoculates them against a lot of bad thinking, but also allows them to engage and not just be defensive, but actually to be able to go out and share what they believe in a thoughtful, winsome, and careful way.
Thank you. So we talked a little bit about a graduate, what they look like. What has been your experience with graduates and how they interact either in the job world or off to college? What does that graduate of high school look like?
Well, it's been nothing pretty much but positive. The school I was at, we were the second largest classical school in Texas, and our graduates would often go off and come back, and we would keep track of them over the years. And it was interesting. A lot of people are concerned, well, should I be sending my son or daughter to a STEM-focused school? I want to be successful. Yet at our school, which we didn't even allow electronic devices, we had students graduating, they were getting PhDs in chemistry, physics, going on with master's degrees in math, engineering, geology, and every single student I knew, they ended up being successful in one way or the other. A lot of them were going into medicine, going to be medical professionals, but some were going into things like they wanted to teach literature, they wanted to be teachers themselves. So if the concern is from a parent, well, will this actually help my son or daughter be successful? Yes, in a sense, indirectly. And it's not, unlike, say, a STEM-focused school, which is maybe teaching just very narrow skills. What classical education will do is it produces a thoughtful, fully functional adult by about the age of 18, which is very unusual in our culture. And when our kids would get hired, I shouldn't call them kids, I call young men and women get hired, their employees, or rather employers, loved them because they could think well, they could pay attention to detail, they had a broader understanding, like I said, they could speak well and communicate, and so they were very, very valuable wherever they were working. Now again, is that 100% guarantee? Well, no, nothing ever is, but in terms of actually preparing people for the, quote, real world, the classical education is absolutely the way to go.
So you're semi-new to the Stevens Point area specifically.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a good mixture of families that homeschool. There's a Catholic school, a Lutheran school, and a charismatic school, but the majority of people do go to public school, whether they're churched or not. That is just the demographic here in this county. Mm-hmm. What has been your experience with parents who want to send their kids to public school for the purpose of being salt and light?
Well, I'm going to answer this as a military man. When I joined the Army, I wasn't just saying, hey, sign up, sign your right, sign on the dotted line, raise your right hand, given a rifle and uniform, and just sent out to go fight the enemy. And in my case, it took 14 months of the expensive, intensive training just before I was even minimally useful to the military. And it was barely, I still had people hold my hand as a second lieutenant. It's kind of a running joke. Most children are not capable of being salt and light, particularly at the grammar and the middle school level. And if they're very solid, mature Christians, they can be, but they're still fighting against an intense. It's not a stream. It's basically a raging river of secularism. And what the classical school does, it actually trains them and prepares them. So when they do go off out into the larger world, they'll have enough experience, and they've been in an environment where they can learn properly and not be distracted. And right now, I went to a public education, but it was years ago, and right now I'm working in a public school temporarily, and it is so different from even what I experienced decades ago that I don't really think it's really not the best thing for your child, because with rare exceptions, most children cannot handle it at that age because they just can't think yet. And what the classical education and Christian education will do is sort of prepare them and mature them, just like I was trained. And I went to war twice, but right when I joined the Army, I wasn't ready to do that. I just didn't have it, and I wasn't just told, hey, learn it and figure it out on your own. I had to go through a lot of very wise individuals that taught me for a long period of time. So that would be my basic answer to that.
So do you think it's because classical education starts from a very different standpoint, where we're starting to train students up in wisdom and virtue as the goal of education, as opposed to filling students with knowledge for the purpose of test scores and later job placement?
Absolutely, 100%. It's essentially, it meets, unlike the public schools, even though there's a little bit of it there, it meets children where they're at. For the grammar school, it takes that natural tendency for children to just be curious about everything, to mimic and parrot things, where they can memorize large amounts of information. So it takes that and it builds on that. It's their natural tendency. And it fills up, as Dorothy Sayers said, it sort of fills up their bins. And I saw that with my own daughters. They came home one day and they just built the solar system in our living room because they had learned everything about the solar system. They took the art, they took the science, and they put it all together, and they taught us about it and spoke to us about it. And this is when they were like in second and first grade. And then as they get older and become more argumentative, it takes that natural tendency, and they learn focus on logic, learning how to think well, learning how to argue well. As they get older, it teaches them rhetoric, how to be polished, how to speak well, and integrate all that. There's sort of knowledge, there's facts, and then there's wisdom, and that's sort of the final stage. And I think that's what classical education does in a way that you don't see at the public schools.
So Kirby, I remember when I was a kid, I was homeschooled for a number of years before I went off to public school, but my mom, she did a good job, but it only lasted a year. She taught us Latin, and there's a few things I learned from that, and I can still remember some Latin roots, but why are we teaching Latin in a classical school? Tell me a little bit more about that, please.
Well, a lot of people say Latin is a dead language. That's partly true, but also partly false, because 80% of the English language has its roots in Latin. It's also the language of science, the language of medicine. A very good friend of mine wrote the Latin medical journal that's used across the United States, and he's a classics instructor.
Interesting.
What it does by teaching Latin, it normally starts around 3rd grade and goes to at least 8th grade, and students normally in high school have an option to either stay with Latin, or they can switch to, say, Spanish or French or whatever's being taught. But by doing so, all the studies have found that by teaching children Latin at that age, it actually increases their capability to understand and speak well in English, how to think more clearly, helps them in science, helps them in math. It actually helps them as well as, if they go into a medical field. And also, if they do decide to go into something like Spanish, my own daughter's doing that now, her Latin background is making Spanish so easy. She comes home every day, she's like, Dad, my Spanish lessons are so easy because of her Latin background. So while it's a dead language, it's still functional, and a lot of our classic came from that era. And some of our kids, they'll actually learn to read the classics in their original language of Latin. So it's not just sort of an archaic thing, it's actually tied into the very roots of our own language and culture.